world never expected it. No one saw it coming. It was a cold evening in Washington, D.C., the air filled with anticipation. The White House press briefing room was packed with journalists, political analysts, and global media representatives. Speculation was running wild. Was it about a new policy? A resignation? An unexpected announcement regarding foreign affairs? But as the podium microphone crackled to life, the entire room fell into stunned silence. Barron Trump, the youngest son of President Donald Trump, stepped onto the stage. The cameras clicked, recording every second of the momentous occasion. Dressed in a navy blue suit, his striking 6 feet 7 inches frame loomed over the podium. Though only 18, his presence was commanding. His face unreadable, his blue eyes scanning the crowd with quiet intensity. Behind him, the American flag stood tall, and on a large screen above, the words, "A Son's Truth," were emblazoned in bold white letters. No one had expected Barron to speak publicly, let alone on a matter of such importance. He had spent most of his father's presidency away from the limelight, rarely making headlines except for an occasional mention in the media. He had never publicly voiced his opinions on politics, his father's legacy, or the controversies surrounding the Trump name. Until now, Barron took a deep breath. The weight of the moment was evident. He was about to reveal something that would shake the very foundation of his father's legacy. Something the world wasn't ready for. "I have spent my entire life in the shadows of a man larger than life," Barron began, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "To the world, he is Donald J. Trump, the President of the United States, a billionaire, a businessman, a leader. But to me, he is my father. And today, I stand before you not as a politician's son, not as an heir to a business empire, but as a son who has carried a burden for far too long." A hush fell over the room. Reporters leaned forward, their pens poised over notepads, fingers hovering over keyboards. The tension was thick, electric. "What I am about to say is not easy," Barron continued, "and I know it will come as a shock to many, but the truth must be told." He paused. His next words would send shockwaves through the political and media landscape. "I have seen my father in his strongest moments and in his weakest. I have witnessed things the world never saw. And today, I can no longer stay silent." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some journalists exchanged nervous glances. Others merely stared, wide-eyed. Was this a confession? A revelation? An indictment? Barron's gaze did not waver. He took a deep breath, his hands gripping the edges of the podium. "For years, I have watched my father rise, fall, fight, and rebuild. But behind the scenes, behind the cameras, there was another side of him that no one ever saw. A side that even those closest to him may not fully understand." The room was frozen in suspense. The world, watching live, held its breath. And then, Barron said the words that changed everything. "My father is not the man you think he is." The statement hit like a thunderclap. Reporters erupted in whispers, their fingers flying over keyboards, their minds racing. What did he mean? What was he about to reveal? Barron's expression remained unreadable, but his voice carried a weight that made even the most skeptical journalist lean in. "What I am about to share may shock you. It may even change how you see my father forever," he said. "But before I continue, I want to make one thing clear. I love my father. I have always loved him. But love does not mean silence." The cameras zoomed in on his face. Every news network had cut their programming to broadcast his speech live. Twitter was already ablaze with theories, hashtags trending at lightning speed. And then, after a deep exhale, Barron Trump began to tell his story. The room was silent, so silent that the faint hum of the air conditioning echoed through the walls. Every eye in the press briefing room was fixed on Barron Trump. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. "My father is not the man you think he is." He took a breath, steadying himself before speaking again. "I know the image people have of my father," Barron continued, his voice softer now, filled with a vulnerability no one had ever heard from a Trump. "The bold businessman, the unshakable leader, the man who never backs down from a fight. And in many ways that image is true. But there's another side, one the world hasn't seen. And it's a side I have struggled with my entire life. He shifted his stance slightly, gripping the podium tighter. The weight of his truth was pressing against him, but he refused to back down. I grew up surrounded by power, he said. I lived in gold-covered rooms and flew on private jets. I had everything any child could ever want, at least that's what people thought. But what I wanted more than anything was my father's time. A murmur rippled through the crowd. No one expected Barron Trump to speak with such raw honesty. Journalists exchanged glances, some realizing that this was no ordinary press conference. This was something deeper, something personal. For years, I tried to understand him, Barron said, his voice thick with emotion. He was always moving, always working, always fighting another battle. There were nights when I waited by the door, hoping he'd come home early. I would sit in my room, listening for the sound of his voice, but it rarely came. He looked up, meeting the gaze of the crowd. His next words seemed to come from the deepest part of his heart. I know people see him as a man without fear, but I've seen his fear, the kind he never lets the cameras capture. I've seen him question if he's doing the right thing. I've seen him worry about the future, about our family, about whether he's strong enough to carry the weight of this country on his shoulders. For the first time, Barron's voice trembled. He paused, as if deciding whether to continue. But then, with quiet resolve, he pressed on. There was a night I will never forget, he said, his face clouding with memory. It was the night of his first presidential debate. To the world, he was confident, some would even say arrogant. But when the cameras shut off, I found him alone in his study. His shoulders were heavy, his face pale. I'll never forget the words he said to me. The room was holding its collective breath. No one dared move. He said, "Barron, I don't know if I can do this." A gasp rippled through the audience. This was not the image the world knew of Donald Trump. He wasn't talking about winning, Barron clarified. He was talking about the burden, the weight of knowing that every decision he made would affect millions of lives. And for the first time in my life, I realized my father wasn't invincible. Tears glistened in his eyes, but he didn't let them fall. He loves this country, Barron continued, his voice stronger now, more than anyone knows. But the price of that love has been higher than anyone can imagine. And behind the headlines and the tweets and the controversies is a man who has sacrificed more than most people will ever understand. The room was silent, except for the soft clicking of cameras capturing every emotional moment. And yet, Barron said, his voice turning sharper, there's another truth, a truth that has haunted me for years. Reporters leaned forward. What was coming next? I've seen my father's pain, he said quietly. But I've also seen his mistakes. And I cannot stand here and pretend they don't exist. A stunned silence fell over the room. Was Barron about to expose the man who had shaped him? He is not perfect, Barron admitted. There are times when his words have hurt people. Times when his decisions have divided families. And for years, I struggled to reconcile the man the world sees with the man I know. I asked myself, can you love someone and still hold them accountable for their actions? He swallowed hard, his expression clouded with conflict. And the answer is yes. The statement hung in the air like a thunderclap. I love my father, Barron said, his voice trembling with conviction. But love isn't blind loyalty. Love is telling the truth even when it's hard, even when the world is watching. At that moment, it became clear this wasn't just a speech. This was a son's reckoning with his father's legacy. And the world had never heard anything like it before. The air in the press room grew heavier as Barron Trump's words echoed through the chamber. No one had expected this, an emotional, raw speech that peeled back the curtain on one of the most polarizing figures in modern history. And yet, Barron stood firm, his voice unwavering. For years, people have asked me what it's like to be a Trump, Barron continued, his blue eyes scanning the audience. Some think it means having everything: money, power, influence. But they don't understand the cost. They don't understand the pressure that comes with carrying a name that the world either reveres or despises. His voice grew softer, as if he was speaking not just to the journalists in the room, but to every young person watching who knew the weight of expectation. I was just a kid when my father became president, he said, a hint of sadness flickering across his face. I didn't choose this life. I didn't choose to grow up with cameras following my every move or to have my childhood dissected by strangers. I didn't ask to be a symbol, a name people either cheer for or curse at. A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. It was easy to forget that behind the headlines and the politics, there was a child who had been thrust into the public eye without his consent. There were nights I would lie awake, wondering who I really was beyond my last name, Barron admitted, his voice raw with emotion. Was I just Donald Trump's son? Was I more than a headline? More than a political pawn? For a long time, I didn't know the answer. He paused, letting his words sink in. The weight of his struggle was palpable. But over the years, he continued, a spark of strength returning to his voice, I began to see that the Trump legacy isn't just my father's. It's mine too. And that legacy, whether good or bad, is something I will carry for the rest of my life. His words struck a nerve with everyone listening. It wasn't just a political statement, it was a declaration of identity. And here's the truth, Barron said, his gaze hardening. I love my father, but I do not agree with everything he's done. I cannot stand by and pretend that every choice he's made has been right. And I know that may be difficult for some people to hear, but it's the truth. The room grew tense again. It was one thing to speak about his father's humanity. It was another to publicly question his decisions. I've watched the world judge him, Barron continued, his voice steady but heavy with feeling. Some call him a hero. Others call him a villain. But I've learned something that most people never will. He is neither. He is a man. A flawed, complicated man who has tried to carry the weight of a nation on his shoulders while still trying to be a father. A hush fell over the room. It was a truth no one expected. One that cut through the political noise with an honesty that was impossible to ignore. But here's what I need the world to understand, Barron said, his voice rising with quiet intensity. Behind the suits and the speeches and the controversies, my father is still a man who wants to be loved. And for all his flaws, I know that his heart, beneath the armor, is not as cold as the world believes. The honesty in his words shook even the most hardened journalists. For years, people had painted Donald Trump as either a savior or a tyrant, but no one had ever described him quite like this. I've had to learn a difficult lesson, Barron confessed. That you can love someone deeply while still holding them accountable. And today, I'm standing here because I believe the truth matters, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's personal. The room buzzed with an electric tension. What would he say next? What truth had he come to reveal? I'm not here to defend every decision my father has made, Barron said quietly. But I am here to tell the world that he is more than a headline. And I will not let anyone, on either side, reduce him to one. The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. This was not just a speech. It was a son's attempt to reclaim the narrative, to speak a truth no one else could. I know this speech will spark debate, Barron continued. I know people will twist my words, but I refuse to stay silent. Because if I've learned anything from my father, it's that silence is never the answer. And with those words, the world realized Barron Trump was no longer just the quiet child in the shadows. He was a voice no one could ignore. The press room was still as Barron Trump stood behind the podium, his presence commanding yet vulnerable. He had already shattered public perceptions, offering the world an intimate glimpse of the man behind the presidential seal. But there was something else, something deeper, that he wasn't finished saying. I didn't come here today to make excuses for my father, Barron said, his voice now steady but filled with a new urgency. And I didn't come here to tear him down. I came here because I believe in something bigger, a truth that this country needs to hear. He leaned slightly forward, his fingers curling against the edge of the podium. The cameras captured the fire in his eyes, a rare mix of pain and determination. For too long, he continued, We have allowed politics to divide us, to turn fathers against sons, friends against friends, neighbors against neighbors. And I've seen firsthand how that division tears people apart. The journalists were scribbling furiously, struggling to keep up with the emotional power of his words. But Barron wasn't addressing them. His message was for the American people. I know my last name carries weight, he admitted. I know there are people who will never see me as more than Donald Trump's son. But I am speaking today as more than that. I'm speaking as a young man who has watched this nation tear itself apart, and I refuse to be silent while it happens. His voice cracked slightly, but he didn't stop. The vulnerability only made his words feel more genuine. I've watched my father stand on this stage and promise to make America great, Barron said, and I know he believes in that vision. But my question is, can we be great if we refuse to listen to each other? Can we be great if we refuse to see the humanity in those we disagree with? A ripple of emotion swept through the audience. This was not a speech of loyalty or rebellion. It was a plea for something deeper. There's something my father once told me that I've never forgotten, Barron revealed, his voice softening. He said, people will judge you for the rest of your life because of your name, but only you get to decide who you really are. And that's why I'm standing here today, because I refuse to let my name define me, but I also refuse to let my silence define me. The weight of his confession hung heavy in the air, but he pressed on, his conviction growing stronger with every word. I've made a decision, he declared. From this day forward, I will not hide behind the Trump name. I will use the platform I've been given to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the children who feel unseen, for the families torn apart by political hatred, and for anyone who believes that the future of America must be built on something stronger than division. His words struck a chord, not just in the room but across the country. Social media exploded with reactions, some praising his courage, others questioning his motives. But for those who listened closely, it was clear that Barron's message came from the heart. My father has taught me many things, Barron continued, but perhaps the most important lesson is this. The truth is not always simple, and sometimes the hardest thing you can do is speak it aloud. But if I have learned anything from being a Trump, it's that I cannot stay silent when the world is listening. A pause, a breath, a moment that felt like the calm before the storm. I love my father, Barron said again, his voice breaking slightly. And because I love him, I will never stop pushing for something better. For a world where our leaders are not judged by the power they hold, but by the hearts they touch. And that is the legacy I want to build, not just as Barron Trump, but as myself. Tears shimmered in his eyes, but there was no weakness in his expression, only strength. And so today I'm asking my father, Donald J. Trump, and every leader in this nation to remember the people behind the policies, to remember the lives behind the headlines, and to ask themselves, are we leaving behind a world we would want our children to inherit? The room erupted in camera flashes, but no one dared to interrupt. This was not just a speech, it was a call to action. I know my words alone cannot heal this country, Barron admitted, his voice quiet again. But maybe, just maybe, they can be the start of something new. And I am willing to fight for that future, no matter what it costs me. A long silence followed. It was the kind of silence that only comes when the world knows it has witnessed something unforgettable. And in that moment it became clear Barron Trump was no longer just a name. He was a voice, a force, and the world would never look at him the same way again. The weight of Barron Trump's words still hung heavy in the room. It wasn't just a speech. It was a son's heartfelt plea for compassion, unity, and truth. For a moment, the constant hum of political agendas seemed to pause, replaced by the raw honesty echoing from the youngest Trump. As the cameras clicked and flashed, Barron took a deep breath, steadying himself. What he would say next wasn't just for the journalists or the watching world, it was for his father. I know people will question why I'm speaking today, Barron began, his voice gentler now but no less firm. Some will call it a rebellion. Others will say I'm trying to break free from my father's shadow. But the truth is simpler. I'm speaking because I love him, His eyes scanned the room, seeking something beyond the blinding lights. For all the distance between them, his words were a message to the man who had shaped his life. For all his flaws, my father taught me the value of standing your ground, Barron continued. He taught me that in life, there are moments when you cannot sit quietly while the world burns around you. This is my moment. A hush fell over the room. This wasn't just about politics. It was about the heart of a father-son relationship played out on the world's largest stage. I've seen my father at his strongest, Barron said softly. I've also seen him at his most vulnerable, something the world never gets to see. There are nights he sits alone, weighed down by the burden of leadership, wondering if he's doing the right thing. The admission caught many by surprise. Donald Trump, a man known for his bombastic confidence, was now being painted as someone who carried the private ache of self-doubt. And that's the part no one understands, Barron continued, his voice heavy with emotion. Beneath the image, beneath the headlines, he is still human. And I wish more people could see that. For a brief moment, it wasn't about partisanship. It wasn't about policies. It was about a son trying to share the human side of a father who had become a symbol of division. I know I can't change the past, Barron admitted. I can't undo the decisions he's made, the words he's spoken, or the pain they've caused. But I also know this: every person deserves a chance to be seen for who they really are, not just the image the world creates. A faint tremble touched his voice, but he didn't stop. My father has always told me to be tough, Barron said. But toughness isn't just about standing tall. It's about knowing when to speak up, even when it hurts. And I'm speaking up because I believe my father, and this country, can be better. He exhaled slowly, the gravity of his words hanging thick in the air. It was as if the years of silence had finally cracked open, revealing a heart long hidden. I'm not here to defend or condemn him, Barron clarified. I'm here because the future matters more than the past. And if I've learned anything from my father's journey, it's that change is always possible, even when the world says otherwise. His hands rested lightly on the podium as he turned his message outward, no longer just speaking to his father, but to every American watching. I believe in a future where our last names don't define us, he said, his voice brimming with quiet conviction. A future where we judge each other by our hearts, not our politics. And I'm ready to fight for that future. The words stirred something profound. Across the country, millions of viewers felt the weight of a truth they couldn't ignore. This was more than a speech, it was a challenge. For anyone watching today who feels unseen, who feels trapped by the expectations of the world, know this: you are more than the name you carry. You are more than the mistakes you've made. And you have the power to define your own story. Barron's voice grew softer, but the power behind it burned bright. And to my father, if you're listening, he said, his gaze distant, as if imagining the man who had shaped his life. I want you to know, I am proud of your strength, but I also want you to be proud of mine. I will always love you, but I will also always speak the truth, no matter how hard it is to hear. A long silence followed, a silence that felt more powerful than applause. And then, with a final breath, Barron Trump stepped back from the podium, leaving the world changed in his wake. He had entered the room as the son of a sitting U.S. president, but he left it as something far greater, a voice that could no longer be ignored. And in that moment, as the cameras faded to black, one truth became undeniable. The world had just witnessed the rise of Barron Trump, a young man no longer defined by his father's shadow, but by the legacy he chose to build for himself.